Michael Penix could be the next great day two quarterback. We will explain why on this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Magdziuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That is $200 if your bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Magdziuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Magdziuk. On today's show, we are breaking down Washington quarterback Michael Penix Jr. in our final quarterback discussion before we make the switch over to wide receivers. Kate, I know you just got done watching him yesterday. What were your takeaways when you put on the film?
Yeah, this is going to be an interesting one. Michael Penix Jr. Now, he's had a long tenure as a quarterback within the NCAA, Marcus. This is a 6-year player who spent 4 seasons, count them, 1, 2, 3, 4 seasons at Indiana before, suffering a season-ending injury in every single one of them. 2 torn ACLs, 2 shoulder injuries, all that ended his time in Indiana. Ended up going to Washington for his 2022 and 2023 seasons. Obviously, very famously went to the national championship game, only to be defeated by J.J. McCarthy and the Michigan Wolverines, who we talked about on yesterday's show. So if you missed that, go back. You look at Michael Penix, and obviously there's some interesting notes when you compare him to the other top quarterbacks in this class, right? The first thing I think you have to acknowledge with Michael Penix is that he is a pure pocket passer. And this is a guy that when we talk about the rushing upside for so many of these quarterbacks in this class, it is not there with Michael Penix Jr. For all of his production as a passer this season, led the NCAA in passing yards, 36 passing touchdowns. He had 8 rushing yards, Marcus. 8 rushing yards. That's not going to pose a lot of upside. And of course, there's always the caveat that, sacks, go against. But you also have the fact that, Michael Penix actually took, relatively low pressure to sack conversion rate. So Michael Penix had a very interesting tenure, but there are a lot of points of hesitancy for me when it comes to investing in him as a dynasty quarterback. First, obviously, there are those very concerning, just issues regarding long-term health, 2 torn ACLs. That scares me a little bit. Now, obviously, mobility isn't necessarily the pinnacle of his game as a pocket passer, but that it's still scary to think about from a long-term perspective. Has one heck of an arm, some spotty accuracy, but I'm not all that excited about a 6-year quarterback who's, I think shown a lot of question marks for as exciting as his deep ball is.
All right, let's go over some strengths and weaknesses just from some of the film that you and I watched. He's in this class. He's probably the best deep ball passer. I think there's other quarterbacks that have better and stronger arms, but his accuracy and placement is so good down the field. It's why Rome Odunze and Jalen Polk and Jalen McMillan were able to put up ridiculous stats because Penix was able to find those guys down the field. I think he's got really good touch. I think he throws with a lot of arc under his passes. He doesn't have to line drive everything. Easily the best part of his game. I also really like how he can kind of move around in the pocket. Like, not a great athlete in the sense of running, as you mentioned, Kate, but really good at knowing when to sidestep and when to step up and when to do these little subtle movements just to create throwing lanes. So I really admire him for that. And then the giant hands. Like, we know hand size does matter when it comes to losing fumbles and being able to generate velocity and able to throw in bad weather. Your guy Kenny Pickett, Kate, really struggled when the weather got bad. Had double gloves, Kenny, right? Not an issue for Michael Penix. Has massive, massive hands. So there is a lot to like about him as a passer. The issues for Penix are, as you mentioned, he's not really a rushing threat. He can move a little bit, but he's not somebody that is going to take off and run. Not a dual threat quarterback. You mentioned the season injuries, the multiple season-ending injuries. Now we've got a report coming out of the combine that fairly clean injuries history, like it's nothing long-term is going to bother him, but the fact that there is so much wear and tear on his body is concerning. And then the one thing that really bothered me was, and you saw this in the Michigan game, okay, when he was asked to get outside the pocket and make a throw on the run, the accuracy was very spotty. He is very much a drop back traditional passer in every sense of the word. Doesn't mean that he can't be a good quarterback. Doesn't mean that he can't have dynasty value, but it's really hard to do so when you are a stationary quarterback.
I think all of those are very fair critiques. And, Marcus, like I'm gonna push back a little bit on there is everything that you mentioned about Penix's deep ball is entirely accurate. I mean, the accuracy down the field, spot on. I would say though that I feel like he approaches a lot of throws, even in the shorter and intermediate areas, as if they're deep balls. Like there's almost so much
Yeah.
firepower that like it does force him to miss some layup throws from time to time. Because I do think while he has the perfect amount of touch on a deep ball down the field where he just puts the ball exactly where it needs to be with the right velocity and it looks so natural, I do think that he lacks a lot of that in the shorter to intermediate areas because it doesn't seem like there are different trigger levels for him. It just feels like the arm is what the arm is. And obviously, at the NFL level, you're not going to be throwing deep balls. It's not necessarily he's not going to be drafted necessarily into this air raid style offense. He is going to have to work, I think, on those shorter to intermediate area balls. Another point, against him, in this is again kind of coming. I watched JJ McCarthy and Penix back to back. So kind of comparing them to what I loved about JJ McCarthy was his ability to throw across the middle of the field. You just didn't see that as often with Penix. And Marcus, you might need to like sell me back into Penix because my initial eval, I have a lot of question marks.
Which I get. Like there are a lot of question marks. We have a lot of film on him, so there you can really dive into it a little bit. I want to talk about him from an analytic perspective because some of the numbers are really good. Other ones, not so great. We will dive into that next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Listen, college basketball tournament starting today. It's absolutely fantastic. I couldn't be more excited. So say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tournament, whether you're betting on a big upset or a number one seed. It's time to go dancing on America's number one sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That is $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even go pick who's going to win it all. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We want to let you know that this episode is brought to you by Locked On Sports Today. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Do you have to turn down that volume with all the shouting? Listen, I get it. Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you the can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Okay, let's talk about Michael Penix from an analytic perspective. You and I both work at Pro Football Focus. We have access to quite a bit of stats. What did you find when you were doing some digging here on Michael Penix?
I found a lot of inconsistencies, Marcus. So first, I do want to shout out the pressure to sack rate, which we briefly mentioned here at the top of the show. This has been an ongoing issue for this entire draft class, pretty much. Like Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Drake May, all take way too many sacks. You have Michael Penix with a 7.6% pressure to sack rate, which is kind of a predictive stat. We've talked about how taking sacks at a high rate and a high percentage of those pressures translating to sacks, that is generally predictive of what you're going to see at the NFL level. I do think that obviously that low pressure to sack rate, it's great. And I do think it speaks a lot to his kind of ability to maneuver the pocket, which is something we talked about in his strengths. When it comes to his entire analytics profile, obviously the sack rate, that's going to be top of the line, 97th percentile, 42nd percentile on third and fourth down for PFF passing grade. That is something that honestly scares me a little bit when I'm looking at Michael Penix Jr. Another advanced metric that has me a little nervous, 54th percentile in PFF passing grade on no play action,
Hmm.
which we know is generally kind of a cheat code. And especially for a guy that is not a quote unquote, like he's mobile enough, but like he's not necessarily going to be a rushing threat to opposing defenses. I'm not sure that I'm all that excited to see him with a 54th percentile PFF passing grade on no play action throws. Otherwise, like first and second down, solid, clean pocket, solid, but at or behind the sticks, solid. But I will say that those third and fourth down and no play action PFF passing grades do have me a little bit more nervous.
Yeah, there's a couple things that I found when I was looking at his profile, Kate, is you look at the middle of the field. Like I'm not like within 5 yards. I'm talking about like from the 10 to 25-yard range. Basically nothing. Like everything for him was deep shots down the sideline or passes at or near the line of scrimmage. That's not super uncommon. Like that's becoming more of a trend in college football. So I'm not going to get over, I'm not going to get too upset about that. But I do worry with his throwing motion, and he's not the tallest guy in the world. Like maybe he's just going to avoid the middle of the field completely in the NFL. And it's really hard to be a successful quarterback doing that on a consistent basis. So that does worry me. You mentioned the no play action stuff. Like it's fine. Like he's an okay quarterback when it doesn't come to when he doesn't have the crutch of play action, but I do worry, like, is he going to have to be somebody that only goes in a Kyle Shanahan or Mike McDaniel offense where they're just spamming play action over and over and over? Maybe. But it also could be that was just Washington's offense last year. So all of the numbers suggest that I think he's going to be a good quarterback. I just don't know if we can come out from this, analytic study and think he's going to be a great passer.
Yeah, a couple more PFF metrics I want to mention. And I do think that this speaks a little bit to some of the touch concerns in those short and intermediate areas, Marcus. Among the 45 Power Five quarterbacks with 300 plus pass attempts, he had the 17th highest uncatchable inaccurate throw rate among those quarterbacks. Now, on its own, you might not think that's a huge deal, but you know who's like at the top of with the lowest rates? It's a lot of our top draft prospects, like
Yeah.
Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Bo Nix, JJ McCarthy. All of those are prospects that they're all ranking, top 10 in lowest uncatchable inaccurate throw rates, and you have Penix that's kind of at the top of that. Um, I think that there's a lot that he can work on at the next level because he does have the arm talent to do it. It's just he has the arm strength. I can he figure out the arm talent bit though?
You just seem like you're really down on Michael Penix. Is that
I
fair?
am, and I feel like I was so. This is kind of weird because like I was so high on JJ McCarthy coming out, much higher than I expected to be, and after watching Michael Penix and really diving into the stats, Marcus, I'm much lower on Michael Penix than I actually thought coming in. It's really interesting because, like, I don't necessarily watch a ton of college football while it's happening. I do all of my scouting once the NFL season has wrapped, but I know who these quarterbacks are and I have a general perception of them. I know their baseline stats. I know all that. So, like, I come in with this sort of foundational knowledge and initial perception. And these are two quarterbacks that, based on my initial perception, their outlook for me has changed completely after this deep dive.
I'm going to give you some other stats that might not make you feel better. So we talked about JJ McCarthy on Tuesday's show about how few of third and longs he actually saw at Michigan, right? Like there just wasn't very many. Penix had a little bit more, but his success wasn't great. On 3rd and 8 to 10, he averaged 6.4 yards per attempt. That was like, compare that to McCarthy, that was like 11. On 3rd and 11 or more, 6.8 yards an attempt. Very, very modest production. Early on in this kind of process, we talked about how you want to see a quarterback's yards per attempt be around that 9.5 range. Like if you're truly going to be an elite quarterback, that's what we want to see. 8.8, which is, again, not bad, but just a little bit lower than what you would like to see. He is a good prospect, but with the injury history, with the lack of mobility, I do wonder what his ceiling is in the NFL.
I think all of those are fair concerns. And obviously, we have to talk about that from a fantasy perspective. But I do think all of these question marks that we're raising right now are all things that are probably going to be in the conversation for NFL teams while they're in the scouting process, that we might see Michael Penix drop a decent amount, which, hey, maybe that means he lands in a solid situation where he can start to clean up some of these aspects to his game, like the touch, like the the scenarios on 3rd and long, like. But I'm not holding my breath right now.
That's fine. All right, let's make some NFL comparisons because I do have a really good comp for him, but I want to also talk about Michael Penix's dynasty value and where he ranks among the other rookie quarterbacks. We will do that next. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you'd do if you had an extra hour in your day? Would you go for a run? Would you take a nap? How about read a book? A lot of us spend our lives wishing that we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you so that you can go and do more of it. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's done entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for any reason at no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That is BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. Everydayers. On Friday's show, we're starting with the wide receivers, finally. And we're going to start with the wide receiver one in this class, Marvin Harrison Jr. So make sure you check that out. But let's finish up our Michael Penix discussion by giving you some comps. Who did you compare him to after watching his tape?
Actually, I think my favorite comp that I've seen for Michael Penix, and let's be honest, like the comps I think for this guy are all over the board. A very common one is the comp to Tua Tagovailoa, and I think a lot of that honestly is just because he's a lefty and Tua is a lefty. So
You know
they
what's funny?
look
I didn't even think about that because that's my comp as well. I didn't even put those together. And I know how silly that is, but yeah,
no, but it does. I think that's a pretty. It seems like a very natural comp because of the fact they're both lefties, and I do think from the standpoint of like they can move around a pocket, but their athleticism is not the pinnacle of their game. It does live and die on their arm. Like you absolutely see in this, like I think Tua Tagovailoa, very underrated deep ball thrower. Michael
a very
Penix,
good deep ball
obviously
thrower.
not underrated in that aspect whatsoever. I thought an interesting comp was maybe Jordan Love, but Jordan Love also feels like a bit more mobile. So
Mhm.
I'm kind of struggling somewhere between a Tua and a Jordan Love, I feel is where I'm at, but I'm still lower on him than I was on either of those quarterbacks coming out of the draft.
Tua is my comp for him because like has to win from the pocket, but does a really good job throwing the ball down the perimeter, right? If you remember Tua coming out of Alabama, had all those receivers, put up big time stats, not a good athlete, but not a scrambler, not a runner. Tua is also very good at manipulating pockets and moving around in a pocket. But I'm not sure he's quite as uh, I don't think he's as good as Tua. Now they both had injury concerns coming into the NFL, so I think he's somewhere between Tua and Aiden O'Connell, who the Raiders drafted in the 4th round last year, who really good deep ball thrower, but just not an athlete at all. He's somebody who has to win exclusively from the pocket. Both have big hands, but both are uh, they don't have the best arm. It's a good arm, but not an elite arm. There is somewhere in between. But what I wanted to mention for his dynasty value is I don't think he's going to be, Kate, somebody who wins you a week in dynasty. However, and I don't think he's somebody necessarily that you're going to want to own in dynasty ever either. But I do think he's a quarterback that could add value to an offense if you have good receivers, like Tua has in Miami, where for the most part, Tua is like a fringe QB1 in a really good offense, but he's able to get the ball to Jalen Waddle and to Tyreek Hill and everybody else. I think Michael Penix in the right offense can feed all of the playmakers, but still just not have a lot of value.
I think that's the crux here, Marcus, is the fact that Penix could be a guy that delivers the ball to players in an efficient and effective manner, the way that Tua does, without holding his own value. So he can support the cast of others without necessarily having a ton of fantasy value on his own. And obviously, we talk about the rushing potential and upside, and it's just not there. That's not his game, and that's okay. But when we're talking about fantasy football and the current landscape of fantasy football does favor these quarterbacks that are more willing to run and scramble and make plays
Yep.
with their legs. Yeah, it's hard to envision that Michael Penix is ever going to win you weeks, which is why I'm
You're
out
out.
on Michael Penix in Dynasty.
I just wanted to mention his value really quickly because he's not being drafted particularly high. QB 32. That's a fringe starter. I've got the feeling that he's probably going to end up as a day 2 pick in the NFL draft, which means probably not going to start right away. Maybe he's going to have to wait or sit a year before he gets pushed into the starting lineup. Not somebody who is super appealing for dynasty, but somebody who could help out the right team and help feed the right receivers if he gets into a good situation. That is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty your first listen every single day. Go check out the channel on YouTube. We post videos every single day over there. Go follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Go follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Majuk. I'm at Marcus _Mosier, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.